Former Vice President Joe Biden is accusing reporters of not understanding his words on the campaign trail. It comes after the former vice president's latest gaffe. Over the weekend in Keene, New Hampshire, Biden complimented the town before incorrectly identifying which state he was speaking in. Here's that clip.
I'm back. I've been here a number of times. Last time was, I think, all the way back in 2014. But I've been here before that. I love this place. Look, what's not to like about Vermont in terms of the beauty of it? And what a neat town.
At that same event, Biden criticized press coverage of one of his anecdotes in which he asked listeners to imagine what would have happened if Barack Obama had been assassinated before the 2008 election. One article that Biden appeared to take issue with was this piece from the New York Times. The paper referred to Biden as making a, quote, series of unusual rhetorical detours at the end of a town hall-style campaign event nominally dedicated to health care. First, you'll hear Biden in his own words talking about the hypothetical assassination, followed by his criticism of the press Saturday.
Two political heroes were Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. My senior semester, they were both shot and killed. Imagine what would have happened if, God forbid, Barack Obama had been assassinated after becoming the de facto nominee. What would have happened in America? Things changed. You had over 40 kids shot in Kent State on a beautiful lawn by the National Guard. There are a whole lot of things. And guess what? When I walked across that stage, I come from a family that had no political influence at all. I'm the first U.S. Senator I ever knew. I got out of school, and in 4 years I was running for the United States Senate. Didn't intend to, got involved in the civil rights movement. Next thing you know, they asked me to do something no one else would do. My words were, and I found that's kind of interesting, the way it was characterized in your papers. The one thing was, I said, I was making the point that my generation in '68 faced a crisis, a significant crisis. And to make the point to people in the room that, I said, just imagine if the same thing happened in your generation. That's what the context was. No, words matter a lot. And I got the point across. You're the only guys that didn't understand it.
Joining me now are Caitlin Huey-Burns and Evan McMorris-Santoro. Caitlin is a political reporter for CBSN, and Evan is a correspondent for Vice News Tonight. Welcome to both of you. Caitlin, I want to start with you. This is all coming as a new Monmouth national poll shows Joe Biden actually sliding into a three-way tie with Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Now, we always say this. We should note there is no such thing as a national primary, but what should we take away from this?
Well, these national polls have played an outsized role in this primary because a lot of them are used to determine who gets onto the debate stage. So that's why we're looking at a lot of these national polls. I think what's interesting about this one in particular is Elizabeth Warren's steady rise. When you look at kind of how fluid this race has been, how really open-minded voters have been, she has been slowly but steadily rising to the top. Joe Biden has been making his entire campaign about electability, about, him being the candidate who can take on Donald Trump, which we know voters are putting high on their priority list. Do these gaffes, do these questions that he raises put that in jeopardy? That's something that we're waiting to hear.
And Evan, Biden's pollster is writing this poll off as an outlier. Nevertheless, based on what Caitlin just noted here and what we're seeing with the numbers for Elizabeth Warren in particular sort of slowly but steadily creeping up, how much of a concern is this for the Biden campaign?
I think more concerning for the Biden campaign is that press conference he gave where he has to explain why he made some comment about President Obama maybe being assassinated. I mean, the fact is, this is just piling up and piling up and piling up for Biden. The very first time I saw him go out and campaign was his very first day of campaigning in Iowa. And on his first two stops, he said, back when I was president, which of course he never was. This is a thing where it's like, are voters going to care or not? We don't really know.
Yeah.
But as long as it becomes a central story of his campaign is him trying to constantly explain why he says Keene, New Hampshire's in Vermont, or what he said the thing about Obama being assassinated, or when I was president, or anything else. That's more of a concern, I think, than just one poll.
Is the fact, though, that voters know Joe Biden because he's such a known quantity? This is not something that's particularly new, this notion of gaffes. Is that something that could perhaps, if you are the Joe Biden campaign, you're sort of banking on that this is the idea that voters already have of him and that it's not necessarily this cause for concern, despite what you're pointing out here, which is this sort of scrutiny of those gaffes?
Oh, absolutely. Nobody would would expect Joe Biden campaign not to include some gaffes as sort of his normal thing. And there's some argument as to whether or not we live in a post-gaffe world. I mean, our president currently is sort of a nonstop gaffe machine as well.
Right.
So it's confusing as to whether or not that's going to mean anything in the long run, but if you're the Biden campaign, this is not the conversation you want to be having every day, and it is the conversation that you are having every day.
You don't want to be clarifying these comments. You want to be focusing on a message. But so then, Caitlin, the question is, when you talk to voters, how concerned are they actually about these gaffes?
Well, a lot of voters feel like they know Joe Biden personally, right? They talk about him fondly as if they were talking about a relative.
Uncle Joe.
Uncle Joe.
Right.
Does that mean that they are going to stay with him throughout this primary process? We don't know. At the moment, when they're looking at a long list of candidates to choose from, they feel like they know him and feel like they can trust him, and they feel like after 2016 that he may have been the one to beat Donald Trump. However, you know, Evan and I have been at a lot of these Biden events. We've seen him campaign. His events are very small. They're not these huge rallies that we're seeing Elizabeth Warren do. He does do the selfie line, the rope line for a long time. He has these one-on-one conversations with voters that really resonate with them, but he's not kind of giving these huge campaign events where he's trying to inspire. Instead, his campaign message is pretty much, look, I'm the safe bet. With all of these gaffes, with the constant kind of reminder of that, does that change people's view of whether he is the most quote-unquote electable candidate?
And fundamentally, right, what we're talking about is a guy who talks about things that happened a long time ago all the time, right? It's either Obama chose me, so that should cover me with anything else you have a problem with, or things that happened way in the late 60s when he was starting out in politics, or in the 70s. And it's not clear to the Democratic Party right now, which is very energized by young people, if they're just going to rally around that idea. So it may not be gaffes that's causing Biden problems. Maybe the fact that he's pretty old and has a political history that goes back so far that it may just not really resonate as much with some of the energy in the party right now.
Yeah, some Democrats might be looking for a change. So Caitlin mentioned Senator Elizabeth Warren and sort of the contrast with the very large crowd sizes for Senator Warren. Her team is celebrating what they say is the largest rally of her campaign, Evan, 15,000 people in Seattle. In 2016, we saw Bernie Sanders draw crowds of similar sizes, only to lose, of course, to Hillary Clinton. So what should we really take away from this notion of crowd size at this point in time?
This is literally the hardest thing for somebody who covers politics to answer. Because on the one hand,
so what's the answer,
the
Evan?
2016 story was, let's look at these machines full of polls and how they show that these numbers mean this, and so therefore crowds mean nothing, right? Meanwhile, we ignored massive crowds being drawn by President Trump, and we ignored massive crowds being drawn by Bernie Sanders, right? Now we're doing it again. What do we do now with these giant crowds? What I can say is, across the board, all the anecdotal evidence that I have is that everywhere I go, people love Elizabeth Warren. Like, she's doing very, very well on an anecdotal basis. I can't give you any sort of a deep dive into numbers that tell you something special, but I can say that, like, you'd rather be drawing 15,000 people to a crowd than not doing that, and she's doing it, and other candidates aren't doing it. And that is all I can tell you about it.
That's your political analysis right now.
That's
okay,
right.
And for the record, we covered everybody's crowds here at CBS News. I can attest to sitting through many rallies. But I hear what you're saying. How do you quantify a level of enthusiasm, right, Caitlin, at this point?
Well, it is notable, though, that there are so many candidates campaigning everywhere all the time that to draw this kind of crowd at this stage in the campaign with so many other candidates, I think, is something. And it does kind of show how we're talking about Joe Biden, talking about the traditional things. Elizabeth Warren, she's not young, but she has been talking about things that are inspiring to the base of the party and kind of beyond it. She's talking about policy. She's talking about big structural change. There's an excitement around something different and new that she is talking about in terms of policy. Whether that stays remains to be seen, but for now, she is pretty much the hot commodity.
So meantime, Bernie Sanders is picking up his first national union endorsement of the campaign. He was backed by the United Electrical, Radio and Machine Workers Union Monday. It's a relatively small union, about 35,000 members. But Caitlin, how are we seeing candidates essentially fight for this big labor support?
I think what they're doing differently now than in past cycles, perhaps, is that they're taking this fight kind of directly on the ground. So you saw Bernie Sanders go to Arkansas to present in front of the Walmart board at one of their conferences and fighting for the minimum wage. You've seen him and other candidates at the picket lines, walking with McDonald's workers, for example, when they were striking. So this is something that we're seeing a real focus on the kind of the grassroots, the actual worker, trying to court the labor vote that way.
And we also saw Senator Sanders going after Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in his hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, telling him to, quote, stop your cowardice and allow votes on Democratic bills. What does this tell us about how a President Sanders would actually work with a Congress, that doesn't necessarily share his goals or his ideals?
Well, first of all, it's not exactly risky in the Democratic primary to attack Mitch McConnell. Like, this is very common these days.
Right.
But I will say, this was sort of the original sort of Sanders dream when he started running for president, right? Was the idea was, back in 2016, the idea was like, look, I can go to Mississippi and get huge crowds of progressives. I can go to Kentucky and get huge crowds of progressives. I can go to Arkansas. I can go to wherever, and I can do this. And we can find these people all over the country. We can unify them together and create some sort of what he calls political revolution. So the fact that he campaigns in places that may not be so important for the Democrats in a general election, like Kentucky, this is what his whole plan was all along. And so what's interesting about his campaign is that following the 2016 campaign, he's really campaigning almost exactly the same way as he did in 2016. This next time around.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're seeing when he goes to Kentucky. This is the Bernie Sanders that he told you he was going to be in 2015. He's being in 2019.
But the dynamic could be different now. I mean, I guess that's the open question. Has the political landscape changed? Is there, with the entrance of Elizabeth Warren now, a different sense of that dynamic at play in 2019 versus what we saw?
Well, how big was his crowd, right? That's not. I'm kidding. We don't.
Okay. On that note, I'll be checking that next time. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Evan McMorris-Santoro. Great to have you both. Thank you.
Thank you.